Ladies and gentlemen, it is with pleasure that we introduce today's MC and moderator, Principal and CEO of R. Adams and Associates, and a member at large on the APHSA Executive Governing Board, Rodney Adams.
Welcome back to the APHSA Leadership Corner. I'm excited to once again be your host today as we continue this series of conversations designed to spark inspiration and innovation. I'm also honored to welcome our first speaker of 2021, author, advocate, political commentator, and strategist, Heather McGhee. I have a lot more to share about Miss McGhee, but first, for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, a few words about the Leadership Corner. This is an ongoing series for APHSA, which kicked off in 2020 as the COVID-19 pandemic shifted many aspects of our life to virtual settings. As we continue the series into 2021, our goal has not changed. We're here to provide you with passionate speakers, timely content, and lively discussions that speak to our current times, including today's session focused on what racism costs everyone and how we can prosper together. APHSA remains committed to advancing race, equity, and alongside many of you, continues to work to influence policies and practices that address structural bias and inequity, connect members to resources, organizations, and best practices to apply a race equity lens, and build capacity within human services to promote social and economic mobility and health and well-being for all races. You can learn more on APHSA's Call to Action page using the link that is provided in the chat. Now, as we remain keenly aware of the contributions each of you continue to make to your organizations, we're also incredibly aware just how important it is to remain connected with others, exploring opportunities, and navigating the same challenges. We encourage you to visit the APHSA website to learn more about our upcoming educational events where you can connect with each other. And 1 year later, it is still our hope that both these past and present conversations with inspiring leaders guiding us along the way can help keep our fire ignited so that we can continue to lead those around us to a better tomorrow for all. In addition to taking a moment to thank all of you here with us today, I would also like to thank the APHSA Strategic Industry Partners for their underwriting of this series. We're fortunate to have the support of many industry leaders who are working alongside public agencies to help achieve our shared vision for thriving communities built on human potential. Please be sure to put your questions in the Q&A pod throughout the session. Now, if you're on social media, you can use hashtag APHSA Leadership Corner and include the handles at HMCGHEE and at APHSA1. Following Heather's opening remarks, we'll have a conversation and answer your questions. Now, shifting gears a bit, it is my honor to introduce our speaker more thoroughly. Heather McGhee is known for designing and promoting solutions to inequality in America. She has testified in Congress, drafted legislation, and developed strategies for organizations and campaigns that won changes to improve the lives of millions. For nearly 2 decades, she helped build the nonpartisan think and do tank DEMAS, serving 4 years as president. Through her regular media appearances, she elevates the concerns of working families on programs across our televisions, including NBC's Meet the Press. She is the chair of the board of Color of Change, the country's largest online racial justice organization, and volunteers for numerous other boards in the fields of philanthropy and social justice. Her new book, The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, is now available wherever you purchase your books. And you can also check out her 2020 TED Talk, Racism Has a Cost for Everyone, which reached 1 million online viewers in just 2 months. Very impressive. Finally, in the coming year, Heather will launch an original podcast on how to create cross-racial solidarity in challenging times. So the conversation certainly will not stop here today. With that, I'll turn it over to our distinguished guest. Heather, the floor is yours.
Rodney, it's so wonderful to be with you. Thank you all so much. It's really an honor to be with such committed public servants. I do wish we were together in person. I look forward to hopefully joining you in person next year or later in the fall in Cincinnati. But for now, this leadership conversation is very near and dear to my heart. So I want you all to know. I am the granddaughter of a social worker. My mother, when I was growing up, spent a lot of time working in public housing in Chicago and in group homes. And for our family, for the McGhees, it's always been a question of serving our community as the way that we live, the dedication that we have to being on this planet. So I feel like I'm with a number of kindred spirits today. So I want to start by just giving you a quick overview of the journey that I took to write my book, The Sum of Us. And then I'm eager to have a conversation with Rodney and then to engage with your questions. So as Rodney said, I spent nearly 20 years helping to build an organization that was advancing solutions to inequality. For me, the question was simple. Why does it seem like Americans can't seem to have nice things? And by nice things, I don't mean self-driving cars or laundry that does itself. Excuse me. I mean nice things like world-class or even reliable modern infrastructure. I mean nice things like wages that can reliably keep a family out of poverty. Nice things like universal childcare and pre-K, universal healthcare, a public health system that is well-funded, coordinated, and robust enough to have our country not be leading the world on so many indicators of coronavirus failures. These are the questions. This is what I meant by why can't Americans seem to have nice things? And by Americans, the we, I meant all of us. I meant both Black and brown Americans who are disproportionately among the uninsured and impoverished, and the white Americans who are the largest group of the impoverished and the uninsured. I mean, all of us in a larger way who have watched for generations the fibers that connect us in our society start to wither, have seen us fail as a country to rise to big challenges, whether they're gun violence, climate change, poverty, inequality, increasing social distance and distrust. It feels like we have been unable to muster the public will to tackle big challenges. And so for the first 20 years of my career, I was firmly in the world of public policy, and I was happy to do it. I was happy to pull together economic research, statistical analyses, legislative drafting, lobbying, congressional testimony, basically trying to bring the right information to policymakers and decision makers to convince them to do the right thing, make better economic policy decisions in the interest of American families. And yet so often it felt like our efforts were falling on deaf ears, that even though 4 out of 10 families with children were struggling to make ends meet before the pandemic, we still hadn't raised the minimum wage in over a decade. Even though we know that our infrastructure needs to be updated from our water lines to our electric grids to our roads and bridges and our public transit systems, we keep only being able to find room for more tax cuts and very rarely any kind of investments in our common future. And so I set off on a journey over 3 years that would take me from my home in New York to Mississippi, Maine, California, and back again, talking to hundreds of people and focusing on a different field of research than I had heretofore been involved with. Instead of looking at the economic data, I started to look deeper underneath the numbers, talk to sociologists, political scientists, psychologists, so that I could try to piece together a story that wasn't just about what had already seemed quite obviously to be solutions for our kind of economic rational self interest, but rather a deeper story, questions of status, worth, and belonging, questions of who is an American and what do we owe one another, questions that always in this country seem to turn on race. And what I discovered as one of the first most powerful insights that I was able to unlock was that one of the most powerful impediments to our progress as a country is a zero sum racial hierarchy. It's a worldview, it's a story that says that there's not a collective we, but rather within our nation, there's an us and a them. And it falls along racial lines. This is a worldview that is held more commonly by white people than by people of color, according to the social science. And it's this idea that progress for people of color has to come at white folks' expense. That a dollar more in my pocket must mean a dollar less in yours. Now, economically, we know that that's not true. And in fact, just the opposite, that the racial economic divides, the persistent ones, if we had closed them 20 years ago, our economy would have been $16 trillion larger. And that's not according to some fringe left-wing group. That's according to a report last summer by Citigroup. Just a month or so ago, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco put out a report calculating that in the year 2019 alone, the economic divide between white men and everybody else cost the economy $2.6 trillion in potential economic growth. So we know that when it comes to the straight math, it's obviously not a zero sum, and that racism is costing our economy. It's quite simple if you think about it in sort of logical terms. If you keep hamstringing so many of your players, leaving them on the sidelines, of course you're not going to score as many points. And yet the core problem, the impediment to finding common solutions to our common problems, to investing in all of our people with equity, is this idea that in fact, we're not all on the same team. And so I set out to figure out why that was, what it is that we could do about it, and where there might be pockets of movement in this country where people are showing that a different way is possible. One of the first places that I visited in my journey was Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery, Alabama, I went to Oak Park, which is the central park in Montgomery. It used to be really the beating heart, the sort of thriving civic commons and center of the community. And I walked the grounds of Oak Park looking for signs of something that used to be there but is no longer. And that was a grand resort-style swimming pool. Now, the Oak Park pool was the grandest one for miles, and it was one that was one of the nearly 2,000 publicly funded public swimming pools that existed in this country as part of a building boom in the 1930s and 40s of public amenities, public parks, libraries, schools, and pools. These beautiful resort-style pools weren't just any kind of pools. They could hold thousands of swimmers at a time. And they were all over the country. In many ways, they were a glittering reflection of a deeper government ethos at the time. An idea that was a guiding principle coming out of the Gilded Age and the Great Depression that launched the New Deal to create the greatest middle class the world had ever seen. And this was an idea that it was, in fact, in the government interest and the government's job to create a higher standard of living for the American people. The New Deal and its corollary and following on policies were ones that had a muscular, robust role for government. And I talk about in The Sum of Us all the different ways that government both invited business and when it was reluctant, forced business to get on the same page with creating a social contract, an idea that it was the role of the people in charge to elevate the standard of living of the American people. And the policies that effectuated that were massive public investments in the infrastructure, the public goods that I just talked about, as well as, of course, the labor standards that created a minimum wage, overtime laws, maximum hours, child labor laws, safety laws, ensured the right to collectively bargain. In the housing market, we saw an incredibly large role for the government in creating and funding new housing units and developments, subsidizing them and incentivizing private lenders to create a 30-year fixed rate mortgage and offering no down payment terms that enabled millions of people who never had dreamed that they could own a house to own one. Then through to the 1940s, expansion and subsidization of housing across the country and into the GI Bill. The GI Bill, which created a watershed of public college education for a generation and included even more support for the middle class dream of home ownership. But in Oak Park, Montgomery, as across the country, as with virtually every single public policy, investment, and protection that I just listed, the public good was segregated and for whites only. From the housing plans that I talked about, which were explicitly racist, explicitly limited the benefits to people of the Caucasian race only, explicitly drew red lines around the nation's Black neighborhoods and said, do not lend, through to the GI Bill, which was race neutral on its face, and yet because of racial discrimination in other government sectors, in housing and education, millions of Black GIs who should have been eligible were unable to attain the benefits. We had a system of public goods that was whites only. In Montgomery, Alabama, the Oak Park pool was explicitly for whites only. It was segregated like so many pools across the country, not just in the so-called Jim Crow segregated South. And when the civil rights movement empowered Black families to be able to say and litigate and sue for the principle that their tax dollars too had funded these public pools, and therefore their children should be able to swim as well, what happened? Instead of integrating the public pool, the citizens of Montgomery and their town council decided instead to close it. They drained the public pool rather than integrate it. They drained the water, backed truckloads of dirt in, filled it in, seeded it over with grass. In fact, they closed the entire Montgomery Parks and Recreation Department. They even sold off the animals in the zoo. And they kept the Montgomery Parks and Recreation Department closed, cutting off a public amenity for all citizens for a decade. When, after nearly 10 years, Montgomery finally reopened its Parks and Recreation Department, it never rebuilt the pool. Now, in The Sum of Us, I talk about this idea, this metaphor of the drained public pool as the story that helps explain how we moved from a country that had created the greatest middle class the world had ever seen to one in which we were shortchanging public investments, and to one in which we were sort of singularly, as compared to the OECD nations that are our closest competitors, stingy to ourselves. Per capita government spending in the US is near the bottom of the OECD comparative list, near Latvia and Estonia. This is the country, ours, with the largest economy in the world, and yet we cannot seem to guarantee the basics of life to our people. Make sure that everyone has what they need and a shot at fulfilling their dreams. Why? I'm sure that many of you have asked this question. And in The Sum of Us, I make the argument across so many issues in our economy that it is this drained pool politics, that with the advent of integration and the civil rights movement, testing the idea whether that big government commitment to a high standard of living could finally at last be extended across the color line, could include a public pool where all children get to swim. The majority of white Americans who had been taught for generations to disdain and distrust Black and Brown Americans decided to turn their backs on the formula that had created those public goods. We have seen ever since the civil rights movement rising anti-government and anti-labor sentiment among white Americans. The share of white Americans who believed in 1960 that government ought to guarantee a job for everyone who wanted one and a minimum level of income in the country went from 70% in 1960 to just 35% in 1964. What happened between 60 and 64? Of course, it was the March on Washington in 1963 for jobs and freedom, which included those two economic guarantees as part of their platform. But this was a sea of Black activists demanding that kind of economic guarantee as well. We also saw President Kennedy go on a media campaign for civil rights to associate the Democratic Party with the Party of Civil Rights, in addition to being the party of the New Deal. And of course, we know that President Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, would become, after signing the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, the last Democrat to win the majority of the white vote for president, still to this day. And yet, in my journey, friends, across the country, I was able to find evidence of an entirely new way of thinking, a rejection of the zero sum. I talked to a young woman named Bridget Hughes from Kansas City, white, of Irish descent, who had spent her whole life working in fast food for minimum wage. And she had believed the zero sum. She had believed racist stereotypes about immigrants coming and stealing jobs and committing crimes and not paying taxes. She had believed racist stereotypes about Black people in the inner city. And she had also believed in this go it alone hierarchy of human value ethos. She had also believed that her own labor was never going to be worth more than $7.25 an hour, and that she'd always be raising her family in poverty as hard as she worked her whole life. And yet, when another fast food worker invited her to go to an organizing meeting one night, she took a flyer on it and she said yes, even though, as she said, they're never going to pay folks like me $15 an hour. She went to the meeting and a Latina woman stood up and talked about her own life, having 3 kids in an apartment with bad plumbing, feeling trapped. And as Bridget told me, she said, I saw myself in her for the first time. And then I realized it's not a matter of us versus them. It's a matter of, for us to come up, they've got to come up too. Because as long as we're divided, we're conquered. The campaign to win a raise in the minimum wage in Kansas City and in dozens of states and cities across the country was evidence for me of the power of cross-racial organizing to unlock what I began to call in my journey the solidarity dividend. And that's the idea of these gains that can come only when we work together across lines of race, when we come together to find common solutions to our common problems. Solidarity dividends like cleaner air, higher wages, better funded schools, and more public services for our people. I do believe that we are in an historic moment of a cross-racial coalition rising out of the pandemic to reject the zero-sum narrative and find common solutions to our common problems. The level of support for labor unions and for government responses to the issues that are stymieing most Americans' economic security is at an all-time high over the past 3 generations. The American Rescue Plan itself is a way of refilling the pool of public goods for everyone. I'm excited to say that The Sum of Us is a book that is capturing in many ways the story of how we got here. Divided and unequal, materially rich, and yet so disparately rewarded for the efforts that our people put in to trying to serve an economy that simply hasn't served them back. And yet, in every single instance, I found signs of the emerging solidarity dividend. I'm happy to be coming to you this afternoon with a great deal of optimism about what we can accomplish together, with more money coming from the federal government to reject the idea that we don't have a responsibility to one another and that we don't have a responsibility to the public good. I know that you all, day in and day out, fight for that vision of a healthy, thriving community where all people have what they need for their basic needs and a shot at fulfilling their dreams. I want to thank you for everything that you do, particularly in this most difficult year, and just say that I think that change is coming. Thank you.
Wow. Heather, thank you for setting the stage for what I believe is going to be a robust conversation. You've given us quite a bit already, and I'd like to dig a little deeper. So, first off, you stated in the book that you had to unlearn what you had previously learned about moments in history, such as the GI Bill and the New Deal. Were there some other things that you had to unlearn to really dive deep into this work?
That's such a good question, Rodney. I mean, in many ways, I had learned the power of information, the idea that the right data to magnify the scope of the problem for policymakers um, would be able to empower and enable policymakers to make the right economic decisions. I had trusted in that the people in charge would act in our best economic interest. And yet, in so many ways, my career taught me that wasn't the case. I have an entire chapter about the financial crisis, and that to me was a real lesson. I worked on issues of financial regulation, trying to, create new rules around predatory lending to prevent what would become the financial crisis. And even though we would bring reams of data to decision makers about what was going on in the mortgage market, particularly back when it was really concentrated in Black and brown communities, I found that there are stereotypes about Black people and money, about Black people being risky, which is itself the logic of redlining, period. The idea, as voiced to me by one regulatory staffer who said, I think the problem here is that we put people in homes that they shouldn't have had. That was the idea, that those stereotypes were actually more powerful than the data and the evidence of the corporate greed and the malfeasance that I was putting in front of them. So I had to learn in many ways that there are deeper stories that we carry. And that if we don't engage with those deeper stories, all the evidence in the world, all the statistics about child poverty and about, what a good investment it would be to solve poverty in this country, how affordable it is, how possible it is, how urgent it is, that's not going to budge a set of policymakers who are carrying a story with them about a hierarchy of human value and deservingness that is ultimately different from what I think many of us hold about the inherent value in every human being.
Wow. The power of narrative is critical. And I have to say, after diving into the book, I came to the personal conclusion that your book should be required reading for all colleges and universities, as this narrative that we've all been taught can be somewhat misconstrued by what was intentionally omitted regarding the building of wealth in the middle class in our nation. Can you talk about the role that the federal government had in creating the wealth gap that we face today?
That's right. I mean, this is one of the areas where there's been, thankfully, a real resurgence in interest in the racial wealth divide, which right now stands at Black and brown families having roughly less than a dime in wealth for every dollar that the average white family has. And there's so many myths about the racial economic divide. There's the myth that it's about education, and if everyone had equal education, the wealth gap would be closed. In fact, If we closed the gaps in college attainment entirely, there's a Demos report called The Asset Value of Whiteness, which really sort of knocks down all of these myths. Just a fraction of the racial wealth divide would be closed. And, one of the most memorable statistics to illustrate that it's really not about anything that any individual can do differently. It's about where history is showing up in your wallet. It's about the compounding interest on racist decisions made by our government long before many of us were born, is the fact that a household headed by a white high school dropout still has more wealth, more home ownership, home equity, savings accounts, securities and bonds, pensions and retirement, more net worth than a household headed by a Black college graduate. So you can be a white high school dropout and have more economic security than a Black college graduate. So the decisions that were made to deny the right to own property, deny the massive subsidization that enabled working class people in factories with one income to get a toehold into the American dream, to be offered a chance to afford to own a house that would then appreciate over time. That was all explicitly done on a racist basis with the logic that Black people were bad credit risks, and therefore the federal government would not extend loans to them, would not allow suburban developments to be subsidized and created by developers if they did not include explicitly racist clauses saying that only Caucasian people could live in them. That was a massive, massive subsidization to create a white middle class that was mostly invisible to the people who benefited from them, and certainly invisible to their children and grandchildren today. And yet it was an effort that we are still living with the costs of. And then when we finally got rid of Federal Housing Authority redlining, we then replaced it less than a decade or so later with subprime lending. And I want to be clear here that the majority of subprime loans, mortgage loans, before 2007, right, the very peak of the crisis, went to borrowers with prime loan qualifications. That means that the loans were what were risky, not the borrowers. The reason why subprime loans were able to get into the hands of people who should have qualified for prime loans was that there wasn't enough government consumer protection regulation. And that is part of that anti-government ethos I talked about as well. We really turned our backs on the formula that created really secure home ownership once we had a more diverse aspiring middle class. And we're still paying for the consequences of that.
It's clear that the government was an enforcer in establishing a racial hierarchy in our society. When I look at the recent events that occurred in our nation's capital, it's clear that government is no longer seen as a quote unquote friend of the people. What happened? When did this change?
So it's interesting. There really was in the New Deal era a high degree of support for the principle that government had a role in making sure that the economy was fair and that people had a good shot at a middle class life. The massive investment in public goods and public infrastructure, the strong role for regulation in the market, antitrust, consumer protection, financial regulation that kept us without a financial crisis between the Great Depression and the Great Recession. This was all a very sort of pro-government, central planning approach to having an economy that worked for the intended beneficiaries. And it really wasn't until the public began to mean all of the public that we started to see the anti-government sort of movement take off. And we really began to see, really on the flip of a dime in relative, terms, in terms of how many years it took for a massive ideological shift among the majority of white voters, basically turning their backs on the idea of government and later of labor unions as well, both of these being the two vehicles for collective action that would have put them shoulder to shoulder with Black and Brown Americans. And I'm very clear, Rodney, I want to say, in the book throughout, to note that everything that people believe comes from a story they've been told, and that we have to look at who's telling the story, or rather who's selling the story for their own profit. And, it's clear to me who's buying the story in terms of everyday voters and American families, but who's selling the story, and whose interest is it for people to resent the very formula that can create and guarantee economic security? And whose interest is it for people to be so focused on what's going on at the border instead of, what is happening in Washington with child poverty being cut in half and a massive, vaccine program rolling out, and, nearly $2 trillion going to families who are really struggling and need it, and to our states and localities that are in the business of serving people. There is a real agenda here, and it's not the agenda of working and middle class people of any race. It is the agenda of those who are benefiting from the economic and political status quo. And that's why my book, the subtitle is "Racism Has a Cost." Is racism what racism costs everyone? Because I do believe that racism in our politics and our policymaking is a distorting factor that is having a cost for virtually everyone.
So, Heather, there was a comment from the chat. Someone said it would be awesome to have a nationwide messaging campaign to share this information with all Americans. We have such a long way to go to change this narrative that has persisted for so many years. Talk about the role that the media plays in establishing narrative.
Yeah, I mean, this is really important. Thank you, by the way, for that comment. That was very generous and kind. As I said, everything we believe comes from a story we've been told, and if you look at the underlying narratives of much of the right-wing media infrastructure, it really is about this zero-sum story. It's about the takers and the makers, taxpayers and freeloaders. It is resoundingly anti-government and anti-poor people, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, anti-Black and brown folks, anti-protest, right? Anti-social justice. Now they just say it. And that has its impact, right? I mean, you can't have that level of message discipline from what has been, in terms of Fox News, our most watched cable network, in terms of, radio. We have 7 out of 10 of, the radio, the most listened to radio shows and programs and networks are right wing, and there's a remarkable message discipline there. Now, I want to be fair and say that there is also, there's CNN and MSNBC, there's, ABC and CBS, and there are other networks, but they don't have the kind of laser focus on what the message is that they're trying to drive. They're not trying to change people's minds and offer a consistent story. They're covering the news, and they may have, other kinds of opinions about the news, but it's not a directed campaign the way it is in terms of the right. And so what that has meant is that you've got this old story. I call the zero sum an old story because it was first created in order to justify the economic model of chattel slavery and the expropriation of indigenous land. It's this idea that that you have to be in a zero-sum racial competition where loss for people of color is to the profit of white people. Of course, we no longer have that as our dominant economic model, chattel slavery and the theft of land. That is not how our economy is run today. And yet we continue to have a more exploitative economy than we should, and an economy that is not functioning at the high enough level to be able to deliver security to most families, because we have shortchanged so many of our public goods out of a logic that we don't want to support something that might benefit people that we see as being on the opposing team, even if it might also benefit us. You know, yeah, I'll leave it at there so we can get more questions.
Okay. Heather, your background as a researcher was clearly evident throughout the book, as I loved how your use of data was interwoven into each story and the content discussed. You shared about a book written in 1857 by Hinton Rowan Helper, in which he discussed the strategy of the Southern oligarchs and how they didn't invest in the infrastructure of the South. Can you talk a little about this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rodney. So this is a book. The second chapter is called "Racism Drained the Pool," and it's where we really, I introduce the idea of the drained pool. But I go back to something that is actually always a puzzling question for me, which is why is the South today, as a region, so much poorer than the rest of the country? Some of the lowest states with lowest educational attainment, lowest per capita income, lowest poverty levels, etc. Right? Why? And there was a researcher at Harvard who noted that it's not even just sort of a regional comparison, South to North or West and Midwest, but it's actually the counties in the South that had slavery, where there was, were active slave plantations, as compared to counties that did not have slave plantations. The slave counties today have lower per capita incomes than the neighboring non-slave counties. And so this was a puzzle to me. He didn't, Professor Nunn didn't say exactly why that was. And I really wanted to sort of, unlock that mystery. Is there something about slavery that would make white and Black Southerners in these counties today poor? And I think I figured it out by piecing together something that Hinton Rowan Helper, who was a very interesting character, extremely influential in the North leading up to the Civil War. He was a Southerner. He was white. He was a racist who believed that white people were superior, had no love for Black people, and yet he was an abolitionist. He was an abolitionist because he believed that the slavery was making the South poorer. He went through and counted the number of public libraries, public schools, parks, and other public goods in Southern states versus in Northern free states. And he found a massive discrepancy, right? I can't remember the figures offhand, but he compared Maine and Georgia on public libraries, for example. And, Maine, which had a fraction of the number of people, as Georgia had, I think it was like 7 or 8 times more public libraries than did Georgia. And so what he determined was basically that the plantation economy, where you had a ruling elite which had, concentrated all the wealth, power, and land, had no need to fund the public. In general, wealthy people in a society consent to be taxed to fund the public because they need public infrastructure. They need a well-educated population to be their workers. Not under a plantation economy. They needed a well-funded population to be their consumers. No, the consumers for the global cotton trade were all over the world. They needed a well-funded infrastructure in order to, get their goods to market, in order to, for example, today, obviously, there's so many ways in which today's wealthy business owners rely on public infrastructure and investments, from the infrastructure to the highway system to, our courts, all of that, in order to, thrive. And in the plantation economy, there was this sense that none of that outside of the plantation walls were necessary. Gates were necessary. None of that public investment was necessary. And so I raised that at the beginning of the book, of the chapter, Racism Drain the Pool, in order to, in many ways, sort of focus us on how it is that economic models that devalue human life and worth, and are antisocial at their core, end up having an impoverishing effect across the entire community.
So this seems like what Helper identified was a precursor to the draining of the pool. But it's obvious that the draining of the pool masked an even bigger problem. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Say more. Say one more thing, Rodney. It masked a bigger problem. What bigger problem?
So as we see that other resources building out of infrastructure in this present day and time is a challenge. How does that play back to the draining of the pool?
Got it. Sorry. Yes. You mean beyond the literal pool. Yes. Understood.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rodney. So, in the book, I talk about so many different examples of where you begin to see this drain pool politics playing out with other public goods. So what happened right after we drained the public pool in Montgomery, Alabama, in Warren, Ohio, in West Virginia, in St. Louis, in Washington State, in New Jersey, right? We've had all of these, sadly, all of these different places where that was the story. So what it meant was that first, of course, the children and the families, though of all races, did not get to have this public amenity anymore. It meant the sort of fabric of the community, the gathering place, was lost. When I went and walked the grounds of Oak Park, there were 4 or 5 people there. Groundskeepers outnumbered the people who were using this park. It was just sort of this dead public amenity that used to be a thriving, public center. And then the richer families were able to build backyard swimming pools, which when we began to see in our history, as we lost the public swimming pools, we began to see more of the backyard swimming pools. And then we also began to see dues paying private membership only private swimming pools and swim clubs. In Washington, D.C., over 100 private swim clubs cropped up after pool integration, right? So what was once a public good became a private luxury and a private cost. And you can see that same move around so much of our infrastructure. Think about affordable college, right? The idea of government paying for well-funded public college was a massive part of the formula that helped to build the middle class and our economic prosperity and innovation in the 20th century, and was a big part of the whites-only social contract that I talked about and described, right? We had the land grant colleges created in the post-Civil War period, with over 10 million acres of expropriated indigenous land given by the federal government to states to either build on or sell to fund these public colleges, at least one in every state. That was, a massive public innovation that allowed so many people to go to college for free. That was the formula. Government would pay the cost. Either state governments would fund usually $7 or $8 out of $7 or $8 out of 10 for the cost of public colleges, and then what little was left over, tuition, $50, $100, $200, could be paid for entirely, and then some for living costs with federal grants like the Pell Grant and the GI Bill grant. Now, then that was for a 95% white college-going public. The idea that you could just go to college and government would pick up the tab. As our population became more diverse in the 1970s and the 80s, we began to see state governments cutting back on per pupil funding per college for their college, began to increase the spending on things like, the carceral state in jails and police forces. And we began to see really the stealth privatization of public college. We saw the federal government switch from a grants-based formula to a loan-based formula. This is something that was, never discussed. There was never a national referendum. Should we require a college degree to have a middle class job, and then at the same time price that college degree out of reach for most families? No. And it's in many ways an example of the drained pool where racism is having a cost for everyone, in the sense that 8 out of 10 Black students have to borrow to go to college because of that racial wealth divide I talked about. Black families don't have tens of thousands of dollars in the bank or in home equity to put toward their children's college. And then they have to go into debt, and that becomes, for Black graduates and people leaving college, it becomes something that stops them from building wealth in the future because they're servicing debt. So it's a massively racially disparate problem. It's a sign of, it's a systemically racist policy, and yet it also impacts 6 out of 10 white students who go to college, right? It's just no way to run a country. When we figured out that public college was a great investment in economic prosperity, dozens of countries followed. Most of our peer countries have some sort of free college. And if it's not free, it's under $3,000 a year. Right now, we're in the 20s as a typical public college tuition. And it's just self-sabotage. And the only thing that explains this reluctance to publicly fund college is this anti-tax, anti-government sentiment, which we've seen is really correlated with racial resentment, right? If you're a white voter who thinks that we should have lower government spending, if you're a white voter with low levels of racial resentment, right? You don't think that Black people are lazy and get too many special favors from the government. You don't have anti-Black attitude. You are 60 percentage points more likely to support more government spending than if you are a white voter who has those anti-Black attitudes.
Wow. Heather, a theme you pointed out to that point was how when surveyed, a majority of white people were less hostile to policies that promote economic equality. Yet when it comes to their representatives in government, they didn't necessarily vote based on the wishes of their constituents. Can you talk about this a minute?
Yeah, this is really a way that I think it's useful to help think about sort of what's going on in our politics today with the economy and public opinion among white Americans. So, I cited those different ways in which white public opinion really shifted in the post-civil rights era to being less pro-government, more conservative on economic issues, sort of turning their backs on the kind of New Deal formula that created the white middle class. And yet the impact of that kind of thinking was not total. White Americans are typically 20 to 30 percentage points less supportive of government policies to help our people than are Black and brown Americans. And yet that doesn't mean that they're massively opposed to all things, right? And so, for example, on the issue of healthcare, which is an issue I talk about in the book, we have a situation where the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, has been unpopular, underwater, less than 50% support among white people for the entire time that the Affordable Care Act has been in existence, even though the largest group of the uninsured are white folks, right? And so that is a very stark example, and it's very popular with Black and brown Americans, right? So that's a stark example of sort of racialized thinking impacting support for a government plan to help our people. And yet, even still, the majority of white voters support the Republican Party electorally, and the Republican Party is not just opposed to Obamacare, it is opposed to any kind of increased government role in providing healthcare. And yet, last summer, when polled, 46% of Republicans supported a Medicare for all plan. Now, that's like the whole other side in terms of, having the government completely be the payer of and provider of funds for healthcare. And so you have to ask, okay, so if so many white voters are actually more supportive of the idea of Medicare for all than you would think, and yet they continue to vote for a party that is so far from Medicare for all as to want to repeal Obamacare, then that's a political mismatch, right? That is a degree of support that is not translating because of the racial polarization and the political polarization of the parties. Take the American Rescue Plan itself, right? The majority of white Americans supported it, but the majority of white Americans vote for a Republican Party that was unwilling to go along in any way, shape, or form with this tremendously popular idea. And how did Republicans sort of sell their messaging against the American Rescue Plan? I can quote a Republican congresswoman from South Carolina who said, "I'm not voting for the rescue plan because Joe Biden is opening the border instead of opening our schools. How is that taking care of our children?" Right? It's a very clear kind of racial zero-sum dog whistle messaging in order to try to communicate to their base that this big government plan is not for you, it's for them, right? The focus on the narrow provision to help remedy generations of exclusion from USDA programs to Black farmers. That was what led the story on Fox News about the American Rescue Plan to try to elevate that idea that this is something for brown and Black people and not for you, white voters.
So you stated repeatedly in your book how other nations have embraced many of the policies which made their middle class economically secure. Many have health care, retirement, childcare, college for their children. This clearly shows that the zero-sum mindset doesn't just hurt people of color, but it hurts all Americans, Black, Latinx, Asian, and white. How does it feel to see this? And yet here in America, we're still struggling to gain some of these basic needs for all Americans.
Yeah. It is, it's something that I have to remind myself and folks is a choice. We could afford to feed and house all of our children and our people. We could afford to eliminate all poverty in America at a cost that would be just 17% larger than the size of the 2017 Republican Trump tax cuts that disproportionately went to the already wealthy. So this is a choice. We could return to debt-free college. We could cancel student debt. We could extend healthcare in a way that would get better outcomes and cost less than our current patchwork system. We could protect our people from the coronavirus pandemic with a robust public health system and by basically having paid people to stay home and address the racial disparities that are so obvious when you know about who cannot afford to stay home, who does not have enough square footage in their home to socially distance and isolate, who has public health centers and public health infrastructure that is poorly funded in their communities, right? If you know those facts about the racial inequalities and disparities of life, not of our biology, but of life, the racism is in the system, not in some sort of biological difference, then you realize that we could have saved so many more people and had our economy rebound faster, if that's what you care the most about, if we simply had the public will. Now, I want to make sure that I'm being very clear that this is with all it's all within our power, right? And that we are almost there in many ways. There is certainly a push and a pull in the American public and in the American politic around, how good we're going to be to one another, how much we believe in democracy if it has to be a multiracial democracy. Um, and yet, I do believe that we should always remember that a multiracial coalition of people put into power in Washington and in the United States Senate a group of people who promise to make life better, who promised to get us out of this pandemic, who promised to address poverty, inequality, climate change, and racial justice. Right, those core issues, and that agenda, that message, that vision of better life for our people, with a responsibility of those in charge to do something about it, won the day and continues to win the day and is actually beginning to deliver. So I think it's so important that we have hope and optimism that this crucible of this past year, both of the pandemic and all of the ways in which it touched everyone's lives, as well as so many of the lives that were lost, and the crises around racial justice, with the Black lives that were lost and taken too soon, even just to last week's mass shooting in Atlanta, and the epidemic this year of anti-Asian hate violence and hate crimes, which we know have been underreported, but we know also were so correlated with toxic and hateful language from the top, blaming this pandemic on our Asian brothers and sisters. And so, we really do have to realize that this year of heightened awareness about these issues, heightened sense of interdependence, vulnerability, has created a basis for more solidarity than I've certainly seen in my 20 years in politics and policy. And we have reason to feel optimistic and reason to push harder with this opening that we have.
So, Heather, I know our time is winding down. I want to shift to education for a minute. You mentioned that in the landmark case, Brown versus Board of Ed, the Supreme Court only focused on the harm being done to Black children, but failed to speak of the harm done to white children. You stated in the book that social scientists discovered, and I quote, that white children who learn the prejudices of our society were being taught to gain personal status in an unrealistic and non-adaptive way. They were not required to evaluate themselves in terms of the more basic standards of actual personal ability and achievement. What's more, they often develop patterns of guilt feelings, rationalizations, and other mechanisms which they must use in an attempt to protect themselves from recognizing the essential injustice of their unrealistic fears and hatreds of minority groups. Can you talk about hidden wounds?
So I raised this issue around the sort of the evidence that was not relied upon in Brown versus Board of Education to justify striking down separate but equal. The 9 white male justices decided that they would focus on the obvious and completely true harm to Black children of segregation. But there was another rationale that had also been identified by the social scientists, as you say, which was that this wasn't good for white children either. And I raise it to wonder whether, if we had had a more complete picture of racism's harms, that really talked about the way in which it was a distorting factor for the psyche of all of our people, if we would not have found ourselves resegregated again 50 plus years later, right? If we had a sense that this was not a zero sum, Black children were being harmed by something that had been good for white children, maybe we would have had more public will among white parents to push forward and to really create the kinds of classrooms that we know today are the best classrooms for our children, the ones in which there are high levels of diversity that stimulate critical thinking, that stimulate group problem solving, that cultivate empathy and better citizens, soft skills. We know that diversity is our superpower, and we are lucky that the injustices and accidents of history have left upon this land a person with a tie to every community on the globe. And that could be our superpower. That could be our competitive advantage. That could be what we use in order to innovate our way out of so many of these mounting major challenges, from climate change to inequality to the mass involuntary migration of people, right? All of these big challenges that we're facing are ones that are going to take the best of our thinking. And we know that on a cognitive science level, it's diversity that does the most for us in terms of critical thinking, problem solving, and reasoning. And yet we still choose to segregate our children for the most part. We still associate white schools that are segregated with good schools, white neighborhoods with good neighborhoods, and we don't realize the costs that we're all paying for segregating the way we still do.
Yeah, your book really does show, it bears out the fact that when white children are in a culturally diverse ecosystem within their schools, they actually do better academically than in an homogenous one. So let me pull a question from the chat. It's going to shift gears a little bit. How do you perceive or analyze guaranteed income studies and programs within the context of the zero sum dialogue?
Good question. So it was interesting, right? The guaranteed income idea was one that used to have, as I said, 70% support of white Americans, according to the ANES study, and fell between 60 and 64 to just about a third. I'm actually fielding, in partnership with Data for Progress, a new study now to try to figure out if that has moved at all during the pandemic, because a guaranteed income has obviously become a more relevant idea, as has a job guarantee. It's something that was first proposed by the first national Black female economist, and is now being championed by Representative Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts. And it's something that I think is going to be very crucial as we look at automation and all the work that needs to be done in our communities. There is meaningful work to be done in every corner of this country, and there are people who want to do work. And so I think we will need to be moving towards a massive public jobs program in this country. As of the latest data, there is still a big racial difference between who supports a guaranteed income and who does not. But it's moved a lot in the past couple of years, both because of automation and job loss and stagnating minimum wage, and because I think of the pandemic. I do think that in general, and I talk about this in the conclusion of the book, the approach of targeted universalism is a way to design policy to refill the pool of public goods in a way that recognizes that we're not all standing at the same depths in that pool today, right? Because of the way that systemic racism and institutional racism have left our communities, in different places resource-wise. So the zero-sum narrative can be one that could have voters who hold the zero-sum worldview hear a call for guaranteed income and be suspicious of it, in the sense that it would be a big government outlay. But the fact that it would be universal is one that could help to sort of minimize the kind of often knee-jerk opposition to this feeling that the government is helping brown and Black people and not white people, for example.
So, Heather, it appears that there is an attempt to attack the notion of empathy, or seeing ourselves in the face of the other, which is needed if we're really process of healing in our nation. Had the opportunity to meet a wonderful young lady by the name of Dr. Gail Christopher, who has done some extensive in the development of the truth, racial healing, and transformation effort, which you also spoke of in your book as a must if we are to recover from the destructive policies and practices which have existed so long in our society. Can you speak about this a minute?
Yeah. So I'm a policy person. I want structural fixes to our big problems. And yet, my journey to write The Sum of Us really made it clear to me that we also have to do work on the individual and community level, on the consciousness level, in order to make sure that our beliefs change in line with policy change, so that we can have a durable coalition to support new policies that are more fair and more just. And so that our people are not vulnerable to the kind of, corrupt scapegoating and demonizing that is distorting our politics so often. So full disclosure, Dr. Gail Christopher, that young lady you spoke of, is my mother. And she is someone who, for years, worked to develop a framework called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And it's a framework that you can find information about on the Kellogg website, healourcommunities.org. And it's based on all the best research around truth commissions across the globe. But instead of being a sort of Washington-based blue ribbon commission like the 9/11 Commission or the Kerner Commission, the idea is that what's really important is to create grassroots stakeholder communities that can come together. And so there are dozens of communities across the country that are already doing this, to find a way to get on the same page around the truth of their community, to write a new racial history of their community that includes really talking about all the different lines of peoples who have populated the land, and what some of the major policies and events were that shaped the racial story of that community. In the book, I visit with folks in Dallas who have done this work and are doing it. And then there is a process to create a real healing circle of the stakeholders, to build relationships that are enduring, and to get over racial distrust and bias and resentments, in order to create true healing among these community stakeholders. And then, of course, the next piece is transformation, identifying the parts in the societies, in the whatever the community is. What are the policies? What are the narratives that are still expressing this belief in a hierarchy of human value? And how can you uproot them? And what is your new community vision for a Dallas or a Topeka, and sometimes people do it on campuses. There are a couple dozen colleges and universities that are undertaking this work. What is your vision for a community that is free of this sense of a hierarchy of human value? And that's a really powerful process. It's something that has now been introduced as a national effort in the Senate by Cory Booker and a number of other senators, and in that U.S. House by Barbara Lee and a number of other Congress members. And it's the kind of thing that we so obviously need, in the sense that, countries with far less embedded and persistent racial traumas have had truth commissions. I think it's really important that whatever we do be something that works at the community level, because there's so little trust in, and there's so much partisan jockeying around whatever happens in Washington, that in order to reach the people who really need to be reached, we need to do this at the community level and have real relationship building, have cops and teachers and social workers, librarians, local business leaders sitting together in a circle and really, surfacing their own humanity. That's the kind of bridge building that we need, to cut through the noise and try to create some healing in this country.
Wow, Heather, you've given us quite a bit to think about and to consider. Uh, and I'd like to say to the group, those that are listening, if you haven't picked up Heather's book, The Sum of Us, it's available both in hardback and audible formats. I really encourage you to do so. Thank you, Heather, for this
Thank
insightful and
you.
engaging conversation. We're
Thank
looking
you so
forward to
much.
at the ISM conference in September. And we just want to ask each of you to join us in May for our next Leadership Corner series. Thank you for being here today.